Today we're going to tie a micro craw changer. Unlike a regular feather changer, you're going to tie the craw with the biggest feathers first and build the taper in reverse essentially. So we're starting with a Ahrex NS172 curved gammarus in size 10 and two 8mm shanks are what's going to make up the body. I'm starting with some Vivus power thread in brown and wrapping well beyond the bend of the hook. Next, we're going to make a set of eyes. So we're going to use some 12-pound fluorocarbon and cut off about a 3 to 4 inch section. We'll fold that over and grab our lighter and just hit the ends super quickly. If you have to, you can do it a couple more times, but try to be as quick as possible. Otherwise, it will warp the shape a lot. We're going to tie them in so about 1 inch is hanging off. When you secure them down, make sure they're at an angle and not touching each other too much. A helpful tip for tying it in is to start a little bit up the bend of the hook and work down, because when it's on the curve, it likes to slip off a little bit and it's hard to get the eyes situated at the right angle. I also like to put one thread wrap behind one of the eyes, and this helps kind of flare them out. I'll secure it down past the bend of the hook just slightly and then snip them free. We're going to grab some flutter legs and tie in a half a strand doubled over for some antenna. I like to wrap it around my bobbin and then kind of slip it up the thread to the hook shank. The key to this pattern is making sure all your materials are prepped and sorted before tying it. That way you're not going through your hen saddle searching for the right feather size. Now you're going to cut two 2-inch long strips of squirrel zonker for claws and tie them in on opposite sides of the shank. You can cut a tiny piece of foam and super glue it to the end to help the arms separate when it's underwater, and it really makes a fighting posture when you do that. But because I'm going to be adding foam later and not using the heaviest of dumbbell eyes, I don't really like to do that because it just makes the fly too buoyant for me. We're going to grab our first feather, and it's actually not the longest fiber feather, but it's maybe the third one. And this is what's going to make our mouth. So we'll tie it in and palmer it forward while pushing the fibers back. Wrapping the feather this close to the barb and around this small of a hook can get a little tricky with the bobbin in the way. Make sure to push the fibers back as you wrap the hackle. You don't want them sticking out like a dry fly hackle would. You want them at a pretty intense angle. I would say 45 to 60 degrees is ideal. This isn't a stripping fly, I would say. It's more of a jigging fly. So it behaves very similar to a Ned rig in bass fishing. And there are certain times of the year, smallmouth and other predatory species up here in Michigan key in on baby crayfish, and it drives them wild. Sometimes they won't even go for the bigger ones, they'll only go for the smaller crays. This is a pattern I'm gonna definitely test out in a couple different sizes on my upcoming trip this summer to the Mackinac Flats and Grand Traverse Bay. Now you'll tie in another set of flutter legs on each side for the first set of legs. While I was prepping the feathers, I also cut a piece of tan foam about 1/4 inch long and 1/8 of an inch wide, and I cut a triangle shape at the end. And this is going to be our carapace, so we'll pierce it about halfway through. Take the hook out of the vise, push it down, put the hook back in the vise, and then tie down the foam. With the foam carapace on this end and the dumbbell eyes on the second end, it will ensure that this fly lands with its head down every single time and the claws pointing up. We'll make a nice thread base for our next hackle to lay on. The second feather we use is going to be the longest fiber feather. And then on the 8mm shank after that, we'll use 2 middle fiber feathers. And on the shank with the dumbbell eyes, we'll use the smallest feather. Doing it in this order will create a really nice looking taper to the fly. Underwater, it really does have the shape of a crawfish. We're going to strip all the feathers off of the side that's closest to us when we wrap, and then snip a small triangle to give us a nice tie-in point. I'm going to slightly speed up the first 2 feathers that I wrap so we can get to the second 8mm shank. You just really want to make sure you stroke the fibers back as you wrap in the hackle. I misjudged how many feathers I would need for this part, so I had to grab another feather off of my hen saddle. I'm using a color called Tangerine Craw Grizz by Schultz Outfitters. It was a custom color that they made for the Bobbin in the Hood event last weekend. I actually learned how to tie this fly there in the class I took with Blaine Chocolate. So when you tie off the feather, you'll want to make sure to push the final fibers back. We're going to tie in another set of legs, so we'll cut a single strand of flutter legs in half and double it over our bobbin and tie them in on each side. Once you get it tied in, you can clean up the head with a couple wraps, but be very careful not to crowd the eye because it will affect the movement of the next shank. Whip finish with maybe 3 to 4 spins. You'll tighten down the knot and then snip free. Next, we'll grab with our needle nose pliers an 8mm shank by the triangle end. Be very careful bending down the circle part to slide it on. It's kind of like watch repair where springs are flying all over the place if you're not careful. Once you get it secure, you're going to put it in the vise. This is where my tension was a little off on my bobbin, and I completely snapped my thread. Luckily, it was at the beginning of the shank, so I really just have to unscrew the thread, do the bobbin trick, get my thread back out, and tie it back on. Part of the issue was my vise was not tight enough. The other issue was my bobbin tension was way too tight. So now we're going to lay down a thread base for the feathers and legs to lay on. I like to wrap up to the absolute apex of the loop, and this helps to give you as much space as possible on that shank to get as many feathers as you can on it. because there will be at least 2 feathers on each 8mm shank, plus a set of legs. And on 6mm shanks, I try to get the same number of feathers. The goal of this fly, it looks better when you get as much material on as you possibly can. Now that's a double-edged sword because you don't want to crowd the eye, because if you crowd the eye on an articulated fly that's this small, you're not going to get a lot of movement out of it. So we'll push back the fibers as we wrap this feather on, and we'll tie it down securely. And then we'll grab the next feather from our feather prepper. If you can't rip off the end of the hackle, snip it free. You don't want to force it and have all your hackle unravel. Like I said before, the way I like to tie these in is strip off all the fibers on the side that's going to be closest to me, except for the ones on the top, and then snip off a little triangle and tie in that triangle. The way I select feathers from the cape is I'll start at the top with the largest feather and slowly work my way down the cape till I'm at the other end and have the smallest feather. You'll tie off the second feather and make sure to cover just the front end of the hackle to help it lie down. I did a little too much, so I had to go back and then redo it. Now we'll grab another set of rubber legs for each side. And we'll repeat the process as at the end of the last section. Always make sure your vise is pretty tight, because I had to reset this shank, which is always really difficult when you have all the hackle fibers pointing backwards and you are working on one of the micro shanks. There's just not a lot of room to get it back in the vise. I'm going to speed this part up just a tiny bit so we can get to the next shank and the fun steps, in my opinion. We're going to add the next 8mm shank. We'll repeat the same process as before by grabbing the triangle end and using our nail to pull down on the circle. You'll want to make sure you rotate the vise over for this part, because you need to bend the last shank up at an angle. So I use 2 pliers for this to secure the tail end. Otherwise, the tail end will fly out the bottom. This is where our dumbbell eyes are going to sit, and this will help ensure that it lands flat. Now we'll use our pliers to flatten the dumbbell eyes a little bit. I like to hold them in my hand while I flatten them so they don't shoot halfway across my tying room. We'll create a thread base on the right angle shank. When you do tie in your eyes, you definitely want to hold the articulated part of the fly out of the way, because it and the bobbin just get in the way of each other. These dumbbell eyes are a little tricky every time I tie them in. They love to slip out of my fingers. I'm securing the hook in the hollow part of the vise to just get the tail out of the way while I do tie in these dumbbell eyes. That didn't work, so I'm trying to use my thumb to keep it out of the way while I get my first 2 or 3 wraps down, and then I can hold it and get the rest of the wraps down. You can use some super glue or resin to help secure the eyes, but just make sure not to get any on the hackle. I'm using just a touch of it just to really secure down those wraps. Now we're going to get our last feather ready, which will be our smallest one. Same process as before, it's just a little bit smaller of a feather, which actually works out perfect because there's not a lot of space between the dumbbell eyes and the end of the shank once you bend up half of the shank. If you wanted to make a slightly larger version of this, you could use a 10 mil shank, a 15 mil shank, and bend that up around halfway. And then also around a size 1 to 1/0 hook would probably work well. I would still use the curved gammarus by Ahrex. It's just a great all-around carp and crayfish hook. Make sure your hackle is pulled back when you tie it off. I like to pull it kind of tight just to make sure all the fibers are wrapped in place. Then you can wrap 1 or 2 times and grab your whip finish and wrap it 3 to 4 times and snip it free and call it a day. And this is the micro craw changer. Here's a little water test to kind of show you its action. It really does look like a crayfish that's in a defensive posture. You can check out more of my ties under Motor City Fly Tying Company on TikTok and Instagram. Thank you for watching my video. It means a lot to me.